Hey everyone, what's going on? So, in the past probably 6 months or so, I've noticed that a big thing within the Gematria community is debating other channels about the relevance and the usefulness of Gematria. And one of the big channels is this guy, Chaotic Truth, that people have been on a whole bunch of times, and there's other people on the panel. And they think that gematria is complete bullshit. And obviously, I don't think that. I'm a person who uses it all of the time. But I do understand where these people are coming from because there's lots of inconsistencies and things that are left unexplained when talking about gematria that make people question the validity of it. So in this video, I'm going to be talking about these inconsistencies and how people are using this inconsistent way of decoding to try and prove that a cabal is behind so many of these things, and there's so many of these things that are rituals, when there's actually zero proof, and the way that people are decoding it, they have no explanation of the inconsistent things that are going on in their decode. And with that being said, it doesn't mean that I think that there is no cabal that exists. It's obvious. They hide things in movies. It's obvious that lots of the news is propaganda. They probably are coding things with gematria and such esoteric knowledge within the mainstream media articles. But still, once again, the way people are decoding does not prove that. And I think a big thing that has happened and the reason why people are decoding this way is because, in my opinion, the truth community was created for a certain agenda. It was created on purpose. And there's lots of reasons that I will explain later in this video of why I think that to be true. But if you go back to when, a long time ago, when you start waking up, you always learn that it's the Jews, that it's the Freemasons, that the Catholic Church is part of this cabal. And what happens is a lot of people they finally get to the level of gematria that they planted seeds for us to eventually learn some of this knowledge too, which I will explain. But once you finally get to this level, since you have this belief that everything is these groups, what happens is that you start finding words and phrases that are associated with it. And then in every single story, you're trying to say that they were coding it to this certain phrase or this certain word and coding it to this specific date. But there's no real explanation of why they would choose that certain phrase or that certain person's birthday, especially when the story has absolutely nothing to do with something like the Catholic Church or the Freemasons or the Illuminati or the Jews. But I'll come back and explain this. And who knows, this video might get deleted. Every time I make one of these, it seems like it gets taken down and I get a strike. The last time I made one of these videos, it got a strike within 5 minutes and then the video got taken down. So who knows, we'll see if it'll even stay up. But and the things I'm saying, I'm not saying this out of that I'm better than anybody and the way that I'm decoding is the only way and the right way and so on. I'm just pointing out the inconsistencies, and I want to explain that I realize that a lot of it is actually mysticism. And a lot of these things that are going, the way people are decoding, it's actually using arithmancy and using arithmancy through English Kabbalah. It's not all about a cabal doing rituals. And I guess that's the difference between a lot of what I have changed my view on with it, is that a lot of these things are mysticism. I'm talking about things that are going on within my own life, and then they show up in the news the next day. And other people are saying that that was the Jesuits or the Freemasons that were behind the story. And it's like, well, which one is it? Is it due to my mysticism or your mysticism? What a lot of people, I think, are doing is using a cabal as a foundation to understand the pattern, just as I'm using synchronicities and events in my life as a foundation, and then things are happening because of that. It's not actually some ritual by the cabal. And honestly, I don't really even want to make videos like this, but I feel like whatever's been guiding me over the years wants me to keep pushing and telling people about the things that I have learned and the knowledge that I have gained. I feel like I'm supposed to be true to people who are listening and try to get more people to break free of what I kind of think is a spell in relation to the use of Gematria and blaming everything on a cabal, which I'll explain here, but I just feel like it's my duty as a truth seeker to try to help people awaken and break free from some of the things that they are doing, because I don't want them stuck in that same idealism, or whatever word you want to say. I don't want them stuck in that same frame of mind for as long as I was, and decoding that way, because there's so much more to the decoding, and there's just so much more to learn with it. And I feel like we're never going to really get even more advanced with it when so many people are stuck in this very inconsistent way of what they're doing. So, with all that being said, let me kind of explain some of this again, because I think it's very simple to understand the point of view that I am coming from when I say a lot of these things. But one of the first things that just comes to mind with people who think that Gematria is nonsense is the fact that there's more than one cipher. And sure, there are lots of interesting things like Jesus equals 74 and cross equals 74, Messiah, gospel, all in the same cipher. And there's other explanations, like Osama bin Laden equals 47 and 110. Back in before we were using reverse even, just the two ciphers, Osama bin Laden 47, 110, like building 747 stories tall, the World Trade Center's Twin Towers 110 stories tall. I think the Pentagon even has Highway 110 next to it and a whole bunch of stuff. But a lot of times when people are explaining these things, it just seems like too much, because they're not explaining why each cipher is important. It seems inconsistent to them. Another thing is, once again, why, if they are secretly coding stories, why are they coding, like if there's a number 71 in a story, everyone will say that it means Catholic. And it's like, but why did they choose the word Catholic in that story? And then in a different story, they decided to go with the number 132, and they were like, let's code this one to Catholic Church. It makes no sense. If the story's about some kid who drowns at the swimming pool, and his name equals 71, and then people are writing Catholic equals 71, and then it's a Catholic conspiracy somehow. I mean, if the story told us that the kid was Catholic, it would make sense, but most of the time these stories don't involve anything to do with the Catholic Church. So it's weird how people are just placing in words that are associated with the Catholic Church because they've programmed themselves. Each one of these words has 4 different numbers, and they've programmed themselves with all of these different words and phrases. So every time they see a number, they have a word that is associated with the cabal that they believe is doing the ritual. Does that make sense? There's no explanation of why one story they're coding it to the word Catholic, the next story they're coding it to Roman Catholic, or, so on. Look at all these. Jesuits, the Jesuits, Society of Jesus, the Society of Jesus, Jesuit Order, the Jesuit Order, IHS, the Jesuit motto in English. There's no explanation as to why they would be doing this, And why would they choose, why are they choosing just the word Pope, right? Instead of Pope Francis, or Pope Francis's real name, or Pope Francis's full name, Why are they choosing to code a certain story just to Jorge Bergoglio and not Jorge Mario Bergoglio? There's literally no explanation why you're placing this in your decodes. And this is why people are saying it doesn't make sense, because there's no explanation. You know, why is it sometimes just Pope? Why is it Pope Francis? Why is it sometimes his first name? Why is it sometimes his first and last name? Why is it sometimes his first, middle, and last name? Why is it sometimes a nickname that's coded? There's no explanation. Even though it might sync up to what you think, there's not an explanation as to why. So it makes it mysticism. Another thing that people don't understand is the date calculations. Why, when people are decoding, why is it sometimes just the regular amount of days, and then sometimes it's this span of days? Why is it that, you know, in America, we rate August 2nd as 8/2? But, you know, so if there's a story about that happened in America, and it was coded, or there's a bunch of 28s in the story, we're saying, well, in other parts of the world, they write the date as 2/8. Why wouldn't they just code it to 82? Because that's how they do it in America, and the story is in America. You know, and whatever, vice versa. I understand the connections that people can make, but it doesn't prove that they're using this. And it's inconsistent all of the time. Sometimes people are saying it means because the date's 8/2, and sometimes they're saying it's because it means the date is 2/8, but there's no explanation about it. Or why does the days matter and not the month and the days? And then sometimes people are decoding it to the weeks, right? So, I mean, it's inconsistent. Sometimes it's coded to the weeks. Sometimes it's coded to just the days. Sometimes it's coded to the month and the day. Sometimes it's a span of days. Sometimes when it's 32 weeks and 5 days, people say that it means 32 weeks, even though that to me seems more like a 325. But once again, I'm just being real here. These are the things that people are questioning, and it is super duper inconsistent, especially when you start placing in all these words and phrases with no explanation of why they're being used in the story. And sure, you can build a good narrative because there's a million dates and whatever that you can sync it up to. I mean, think about it. Like, how many times, like, do people say that it's decoded? They're coding the story to, like, the Arturo Sosa's birthday because he's the superior general of the Jesuits. And then other times it's the day the Jesuits were formed. And other times it's the day the Jesuits were recognized by Rome. And other times it's Pope Francis's birthday. Now it'll be connected to his death day. It'll be the day that Ignatius of Loyola became a saint, or the day he got hit by a cannonball, or the day he was born, or the day he died, or... You know what I mean? There's a million different days that you can sync all this up. And then you take all of these phrases that people have and think about all the words and the numbers that can be associated. I mean, there's literally going to be a way to sync it up to one of these certain special days that exist. And a lot of times nobody is explaining why that is important. They're not explaining why they chose to sync it to Arturo Sosa's birthday and not Pope Francis's birthday. Once again, it is very, very inconsistent. And this is what makes it mysticism. It doesn't prove a ritual because you're just using mysticism to understand a pattern. Now, say there was a story about Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un in the news, right? Donald Trump, Kim Jong-un. And that story was about a $48 million missile that was going to be shot or something like that. $48 million. Now it would be fair to write Donald Trump equals 48. Kim Jong-un equals 48. The story came 48 days before Trump's birthday. You see, these things make sense to code to the story because they actually are involved in what the story is about. You know, like Donald Trump equals 48. Kim Jong-un equals 48. But once again, people are still going to say, you know, why are they in different ciphers? But the point I'm making further, though, is just the fact that, you know, what people are doing in their decodes is then writing Illuminati equals 48. And then they're writing Freemason equals 48. And it's like, well, that's interesting, but that doesn't really prove that they're coding. Why did they choose Freemason and not Freemasonry, or not ancient accepted Scottish rite of Freemasonry, or not just Scottish, or, why did they choose Freemason? It's left unexplained. It's just straight up just your belief that that's what they're coding it to. Same with Illuminati. Why didn't they code it to Order of Illuminati, or the Order of Illuminati, or Bavarian Illuminati? Just because you can throw in a certain phrase like that and it does link up, it doesn't prove that they actually were choosing that phrase and to code the story with. You understand what I'm saying? Unless you can literally explain why they chose the words Freemason there and not Freemasonry and so on, it doesn't prove it. It'd be like just writing in any random phrase that equaled 48 and saying that that's what it means. Because there's literally no proof and no explanation of why they would choose a certain thing. That's why a lot of people, when they're doing stuff, they write like, Jesus is the Savior. I don't know if you've ever seen a bunch of people decode like that. And then they'll see 111, and then they'll write, Jesus is the greatest ever, and it'll equal 111. And then they write this big old list. And to me, that's just ridiculous. It's just, sure, if you understand that that's just mysticism, that's okay. But, it doesn't prove anything. You know what I mean? And that's no different than when people are writing Freemason in the story that has nothing to do with Freemasonry. I mean, other than your belief that they're coding that word, but you're not explaining why they're coding that word. There's no explanation why they didn't choose that instead. Now, if the story involved a Freemason who sold the story literally said, like, this guy was a Freemason, and he sold that $48 million missile to Kim Jong-un, and then it would make sense to write the word Freemason, because the story actually involved something to do with Freemasonry and a Freemason, right? But still, it leads to the question, why would they just choose the word Freemason and not Freemasonry to the story? These are the things that people are asking. These are the questions that people are not explaining, and without explaining these, it just, it doesn't seem to be legit to people. Or what about this thing? And maybe I'm wrong here. I don't know what the deal is, but there's a lot of times where people will change this. They'll say 129 is 201 in base 8 counting. Like, what does that even mean? 129 is the same as 201 in base 8 counting? Is there a reason that people are using base 8 counting? Like, we don't use base 8 in our math. So maybe I'm mistaken, but is there a real reason that people are changing it to base 8 to make it a 201? It really makes zero sense that if we don't use it, then why are they changing it? There's also base 6 counting where 201 is 72. And there's base 12 counting where 201 is 289. And there's base 16 counting where 201 is 513. Why does base 8 counting, what does that have to do with anything? It's just another way to find a 201 and then blame it on, the Jesuit order. Which, don't get me wrong, there is a humongous pattern with the Jesuits and the number 201, right? Pope Francis's full name equals 201, and he stayed at the room 201, which was called the Domus Sanctae Marte, that equals 201, and 201 Jesuits were saved by Catherine the Great, yada, 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 There is a pattern with 201 and the Jesuits, but once again, that doesn't mean that every time there's a news story and there's a number 201, or a sports game, or anything connected to the number 201, it doesn't prove that the Jesuits were responsible for that 201. Unless the story was about a Jesuit, or even something to do with the Catholic Church, it doesn't prove that they're responsible for that pattern. It doesn't prove that it was some ritual. That 201 might be connected to something completely different that has nothing to do with the Catholic Church. The point is, it doesn't prove a ritual existed. It doesn't prove that it's even, that 201 was even placed there on purpose by a cabal. Because there's a million other ways to look at it. Same with, what about sports, right? A big thing is in sports decoding, there's no way people are millionaires. If this really worked, everyone in this community would be a huge millionaire. But people get a lot wrong. They might get a lot right, but they also get a lot wrong. And once again, it's inconsistent. One time they'll say it's connected to the coach's birthday and the coach's record. Next time it's to some player, or next time it's to the star player. There's literally no consistency to it. Sometimes it's connected to the home and away record. Sometimes it's to the all-time record. Sometimes it's just to their regular season record. Sometimes it's supposedly connected to the Pope. Sometimes it's, supposedly connected to, like, Thanksgiving, if the football game's on Thanksgiving, but then there'll be, like, 3 games on Thanksgiving, and one of them syncs up to the word Thanksgiving, and the rest of them don't, which, once again, it's inconsistent. They're not creating a bunch of multiple narratives. You're just noticing a bunch of different patterns and then trying to decipher the game through them patterns using mysticism. Sure, some of the games, it's obvious that some of the things are rigged. It's very obvious that it's rigged, but not all of the things with Gematria that are going on are some script by the cabal, I mean, things like taking Kobe Bryant out with 4.1 seconds left in his final game, that seems like it was done on purpose, right? Of course, Kobe Bryant equals 41, and his retirement poem was Dear Basketball that equaled 41, and the helicopter that he was in crashed 41 minutes after takeoff, and the pilot's name equaled 41, and Kobe was 41 years old, and a bunch of stuff, right? You still can't prove that it was a ritual. You can't prove that it wasn't just mysticism and a synchronicity, but it seems that was done on purpose, you can even go back to July of 2019. I have a video where I talked about how I thought the whole season was going to be scripted around Kobe Bryant. For one, because he was going to be turning 41 years old, and, then he ends up dying in that season. But for two, DeMarcus Cousins had signed with the Lakers that summer, and DeMarcus Cousins tore his Achilles on January 26th of 2018, which coincidentally would later be the day that Kobe Bryant died. But DeMarcus Cousins signed with the Lakers that day, and DeMarcus Cousins' Achilles injury was synced up to the number with Kobe Bryant and stuff, and Kobe tearing his Achilles. And then DeMarcus Cousins got injured, and then they signed Dwight Howard on Kobe Bryant's birthday. And Dwight Howard was going to be 34 years old, which is another humongous number that I've talked about with Kobe Bryant for years. Nobody was talking about the number 34 in Kobe Bryant. My whole video is all about the number 34 in Kobe Bryant, but I guess the point I'm making is that I have a video talking about how I thought the whole season was going to be scripted around Kobe Bryant and his Achilles injury, and then it was scripted all around Kobe Bryant and his Achilles injury, and he even died on the same day that DeMarcus Cousins tore his Achilles. And, so I know Gematria, there's actual usefulness to this, and it makes sense, but once again, I still can't prove that was a ritual, and it wasn't just the way the world worked. For real. Especially when this kind of stuff happens all of the time, every single day, everywhere. A few years back, the principal at the high school in town, which I live in a town of like 1,000 people, right? Really small school. They have 8-man football even. I haven't been to an 8-man football game ever. It was 11-man when I graduated in 2001. I went to one game, actually, years ago. But anyway, the principal, who I went to high school with, he asked if they could use my DJ equipment for the music and stuff and the announcing at the game, because their PA was broken and they still hadn't received their new one to hook up. So I went down there and I hooked up all my DJ stuff and whatever. And, we ended up winning. My school is called Booyer Valley, that equals 56. And we ended up beating a team with 56 points. And actually the score is 56-12. So we won by 44 points. And we scored 56 points. So we won by 44 points. The team that we were playing was Griswold. That equals 44. Believe it or not, one of our star players got injured after he scored a touchdown. And his name equals 44 also. It's like, so one of the star players gets injured after celebrating a touchdown. His name equals 44. He gets injured against the team that equals 44, and we ended up winning by 44 points. So, I mean, with things like that happening, how can you distinguish it? How can you discern whether the Kobe Bryant one was really scripted or if it just happened in the same manner, because this happens all of the time? You know, they didn't even have a PA again the next week, and I had to go back one more time, and we also scored 56 points again in that game. But if this was college or pro or anything else, everyone would say that it means Society of Jesus. But it's like, once again, why did they choose Society of Jesus instead of the Society of Jesus? Or why didn't they just use Jesuit or the Jesuits or IHS or the Jesuit motto? You see what I'm saying? It doesn't make any sense. There's no consistency or proof explaining why these things are being done. And also, you know, while I'm on the topic of sports, how come, like, if you write out, like, Major League Baseball, right? Major League Baseball, it equals 162. And it is interesting that there's 162 regular season games. Major League Baseball equals 162. What is it? Just baseball equals 162. That is very, very interesting, right? I find that interesting. But when you compare it to all the other major leagues, like National Basketball Association, it doesn't equal 82, and there's 82 regular season games. You know, if you do that with hockey, there's not 82, it doesn't equal 82, like the 82 regular season games. You do that with football, National Football League, even NFL, nothing. It doesn't link up to that same pattern. So it's like 1 out of 4 does that. Well, once again, people are going to say, well, that's pretty inconsistent. If all 4 of them did that, then it would be very interesting. Even if 3 of the 4 did that, people might be like, wow, that is pretty crazy. But it's only 1. It's only baseball, you know? And I get it. Like, sure, the baseball field does look like the Masonic square and compass, and baseball's supposedly founded by Abner Doubleday, who was a Freemason, but the guy who founded basketball, James Naismith, was also a Freemason, and Walter Camp, the football guy, he was in Skull and Bones. So it's like, why don't these things associate that same way? These are the questions that people ask. And a lot of times we're using this, the way it's decoded this way, to prove some ritual, but it doesn't really prove the ritual. And sure, we know that Freemasonry knows things about, you know, using arithmancy and numbers and, you know, the 33 pillars that are outside of the headquarters in Washington, D.C. that are all 33 feet tall, and you have to be a 33rd degree member. And, you know, a lot of that, there's all kinds of stuff that goes along with that, you know. When you think about foundation and your vertebrae, 33 vertebrae, and Manly P. Hall even writes about Gematria and the secret teachings of all ages. So you know that it exists, and it's probably being used, but just once again, there's no explanation of why these things are being done. And without an explanation of why they chose each word, why each cipher is important, it really just makes it mysticism. Another thing that people often say, you know, to make Gematria seem legit is they'll say that the English language came out around the time of the Jesuits, the same time that the Gregorian calendar was released, and all of this was released at the same time, you know, so they could perform rituals and coincide them and such. And then, you know, you go on to say, since it was created by the Pope, and Pope equals 52, that's why there's 52 weeks. And of course, words like Gematria equal 52, Kabbalah equals 52. And I mean, that's kind of interesting, but what about the Julian calendar? That's also 52 weeks. I mean, the Julian calendar had nothing to do with the Pope. It has to do with, it's named after Julius Caesar. That was the calendar that everybody used before the Gregorian calendar. It was also 52 weeks. So how does that make sense to say that Pope equals 52 and it was named in honor of the Pope, and that's why it's 52 weeks? It doesn't make any sense. Why doesn't Julius Caesar's name equal 52 then? if it also uses 52 weeks? And, why did they decide to code it just to the word Pope and not to Pope Gregory the 13th or whatever it was, right? Pope Gregory the 13th, or even just Gregory the 13th. Why didn't they link it up to that? Why did they just choose the word Pope? I mean, this was the actual Pope. You think they would use his name in the code, It sounds all cool and stuff, but I mean, I've shown a million examples of this existing way before the Jesuits were even created when you look at the history. And then, why did they choose 52 weeks to code it just the Pope? Why did they choose 52? Why didn't they code it to the 12 months or to the 365 days? Think about it. I mean, these are things that people are asking. And, they created these to coincide, to do their rituals and so on. For one, have you ever studied how all the Gematria connects to the Julian calendar? It might connect to that as well. You know what I mean? There's lots of different things. I mean, there's a ton of other calendars that haven't been studied that it probably could connect to as well, not just the Gregorian. But, for all these rituals and stuff, the Aztecs, right? The Aztecs, way before the Jesuits, they had a 52-year cycle calendar even, and the history tells us that they actually ritually sacrificed people. So even the Aztecs had a connection to the 52 with calendars that had nothing to do with the Pope or the Jesuits. And if it was created for these rituals and such, and for this cabal to do rituals and connect to, then, I mean, how can you explain things, all of these things that go on every single day? Like, why was I born in the year 82, 82 days before my mom's birthday, and my mom's full name, married name, and maiden name both equal 82? And my dad's name equals 213, and I was born 213 days after his birthday. My parents' birthdays are separated by 2 months and 13 days, 213. My sister's name equals 82. I mean, if it's all just for the purpose of ritual, how are these other things going on all of the time linked up to the same system if we're not participating in the rituals? I mean, another small example, back in 2021, I was talking about the same thing about the way people are decoding and blaming everything on the cabal and making all the numbers equal 56 means Society of Jesus and such. And then a little bit later, I drove to Denison to get some Mexican food at El Jimador. And when I got there, this obituary was up on the wall. And it was Marcia Pope. And I was like, what are the odds? And I'm talking about the Pope and how not everything is connected to the Jesuits and it's not all rituals and so on. And I get there and there's a lady named Marcia Pope who died age 56 on the door. And she died in October and I was there in December. So it was weird that obituary was still even up on the door. But her name, Marcia Pope, equaled 56. She died age 56. And when you look up her obituary, her only kid that was born, he just so happened to be born on December 17th, which just so happened to be Pope Francis's birthday. And she also died on October 18th, which is the same day as Event 201, right? The big thing connected to the Jesuits that we actually learned from a guy who went to a Jesuit school. How interesting. I'll explain that later, and that also means it was 21 days after the Jesuit anniversary, the day they were recognized by Rome, 21. And she died in the year 21. And she got married to her husband on the date 2-1 right here. And she died on the day leaving 21, or her birthday was the day leaving 21 days in the year. Right? The word Jesuit equals 21. Jesuit, Pope, she has the numbers to the Society of Jesus. Further, a couple years later, I got asked to DJ a party for her son's birthday. I don't even know who he was. And then the party ended up getting canceled. I thought that was funny. And then in May that next year, he ended up committing suicide. And he killed himself 5 months and 6 days after his mom's birthday, right? 56. Pope equals 56. Marcia Pope equals 56. Her son ended up dying 5 months and 6 days after her birthday, years later. And his birthday was the same day as Pope Francis's birthday. I mean, the point that I'm making is that, was this the Jesuits because of that? Did the Jesuits make this happen? Yet it's still synced up to the calendar, it's synced up to the numbers of the Jesuits. And I mean, these things happen all of the time. And the point is, there's no way to discern this because when this happens in the news, now we're saying that it's a ritual because it's connected to all these numbers, but yet it happens all of the time in real life connected to these same numbers, these same dates. But, where do you draw the line as to how do you prove that the ones in the news are a ritual just by showing the numbers when you can show the numbers to other things that have nothing to do with the mainstream media that are connected to the same thing? It's because it's mysticism. Another thing that people do that doesn't make that much sense is they decode stories writing words like ritual and ritual sacrifice and just the word sacrifice and ritual blood sacrifice and blood sacrifice and death and kill, right? They decode stories talking about these words. And they'll even go as far as to say, as like when somebody dies, they'll say they had fateful name gematria because their name equaled 38. But it's like, really think about this. No matter what age they die, it's going to be connected, to the word death. Like, it doesn't matter when they die. There's no way you can have fateful name gematria. That doesn't even make any sense because no matter what age you die, somebody's going to write that they're going to write the word death because your name equals 38. It makes no sense to do. And there's a million times where people die in the news and it's not connected to any of these numbers. So once again, it doesn't make that much sense. There's a million times where people die and it's not connected to the numbers of ritual or ritual sacrifice or anything. But if all these things are rituals, then why aren't they coding the word ritual to that, Why is it only sometimes they code the word ritual and other times they don't? Or even just things like mathematics. Why would they code the word mathematics? If it's all mathematics, why do they only sometimes code the word mathematics? It doesn't really make that much sense to put in the decode. I mean, this all goes back to the same thing I was saying earlier, how you could just write, Jesus is the best guy ever, and say that was on they were coding it to that. I mean, you're just throwing in a phrase by a belief. You know what I mean? And you always have to change it to something else to make it fit. Like, if it doesn't fit the word ritual, then you got to put sacrifice next to it. And if that doesn't fit, then you got to add like blood ritual sacrifice. See what I'm saying? I'm not saying that ritual sacrifices don't happen. It probably does happen. The police even have a song about it and so on. But as far as gematria goes, there's no explanation as to why they chose the word ritual or why they chose blood ritual or ritual sacrifice or just sacrifice or any of the sort. There's no explanation, Like for example, whatever. I'm trying to be respectful, I just want people to learn. But like, I've talked about Toby Keith recently in my last video in this dream theme, right? But if you go to like Zack's blog post about Toby Keith, it's, it's interesting. He died 62 days before the Country Music Awards, and he died age 62. But I mean, who knows if it was a sacrifice? You don't know for sure just because the word sacrifice equals 62. And then you go further, and then it's like, he died 154 days before his birthday. Now they're coding the word ritual sacrifice. It's like, okay. Like, there's no explanation as to why they would do that. Like, And now it's in the satanic cipher, and it was 213 days after his birthday. So that means death, because death equals 213. In the comments, even like Mason equals 62, the Jesuits equals 62. Well, what was it? Is it the Masons or is it the Jesuits? Or why didn't they just code Jesuits or Jesuit order or whatever? Or this person, Toby equals 62. Okay, why'd they choose the first name? Why didn't they choose Toby Keith? It doesn't make sense. I mean, if someone can explain why, then people will get on board. It'll be Gematria will blow up like crazy if someone can explain why they would choose just the first name in one story and then in the next story just the last name, or it's inconsistent as fuck though. It doesn't make any sense. That's why people don't get on board with it. That's why people think it's all nonsense. And like the point I'm making is like, so he writes all this stuff about all this sacrifice and whatever, but then like I've recently been talking about Toby Keith in a dream theme, right? And it had to do with a dream about my dad dying, and it also involved Enter the Stars, and a dream that he had about his dad dying. And I just recently talked about it my last video. Then we're getting stories about the Kentucky Derby, and all the stories say, Toby Keith's dream is coming true. What are the odds? They're even involving the word dream in all these stories about Toby Keith, because he has a horse that's going to be running in the Kentucky Derby this year, which is another thing that I've been talking about like crazy, is the connection to the Kentucky Derby and how it might be related to this. And then now there's stories about the dream and Toby Keith, right? It makes sense. What I was talking about that had nothing to do with the Jesuits or anything. It all had to do with a dream that I had. It is related to this story with Toby Keith. And, Toby Keith died 213 days after his birthday. Remember how my dad's name equals 213? And my dad's birthday is 213 days before my birthday? Toby Keith also died when my dad was 66 years old. And look at my name. My dad's name, 66, 213. So Toby Keith died when my dad was 66 years old. He died 66 days before my dad's birthday. And my dad's name equals 66, and he was 66 years old. And if you go back and look at that stuff with the dream, it had to do with Enter the Stars, who also equals 66. And I mean, there's a ton more things that I could talk about. How Toby Keith, that dream theme had to do with the FIU bridge collapse and bridge collapses, and Toby Keith equals 128, like bridge collapse. And my dad actually retired on the January 28th from his job. And there was that bridge collapse that was connected to the 9 days before stuff that was connected to the dream theme that I was talking about with Toby Keith and my dad. And that dream was on the 36th, or on the date 3/6, right? Just like how bridge equals 36, and Toby Keith died on the 36th day of the year. So the point I'm making is that it's super connected to my dad and this dream that I had. Absolutely connected. So what is it? Is it connected to my dad, or is it connected because the cabal was like, hey, let's do ritual sacrifice or whatever? It just doesn't make any sense. At least I understand that it's mysticism, and it's crazy how it all links up. And there's probably a lot more that I need to learn in relation to the mysticism and why it happens. But once again, why, at least there's a real narrative that is being followed. It's not just making up a phrase that fits and saying that that's what was going on. And another example a while back was like the word death equals 25 and 97. And supposedly the date September 27th or 25th is a crazy day for September 25th. It's a crazy day for celebrity deaths and so on. And I mean, just go and look at all these other deaths. I mean, look at the first of September 24. Well, let's see here. Hold on. Just the months, right? So the 25th is supposed to be the worst day, right? Because it links up to the word death. Death equals 25. September 25th is the day that leaves 97 days in the year. Death equals 97. It's also the 25th of the month. I mean, but let's go to the 25th. There's a considerable amount of deaths on the 25th, right? Right here. But I mean, just look at some of the other ones. Like this one's way longer, the 27th. Well, that's the Jesuit anniversary, I guess. That one's just as long, the 28th. 29th is longer. I mean, the point is that look at all these other days where tons of people died. That wasn't a date that was supposedly fateful. And this is just 1 month. You can go look at all of these other months. People say there's the kill dates, right? The kill date and tons of people die not on the kill date. Celebrities die all the time not on the kill date, but then if somebody dies on one of these dates that's supposedly the kill date, then all of a sudden everyone says, look, and they died on the kill date. And it's like, well, what about all these other people celebrities who died that weren't on the kill date? You know, it doesn't, I sort of get what people are talking about, but it's just like, it's inconsistent. It doesn't make any sense, you know? Just this month alone, if the 25th is so terrible, then why did so many people die on the 1st? You know, why did so many people die on the 2nd and the 3rd? Looks like more people died on some of these days than the other one that's supposed to be worse. So, I mean, I'm just trying to point out the inconsistencies. This is why people won't get on board with Gematria, because there's so many inconsistent things, and things aren't explained as to why you're using a certain cipher, or, you know, why you're linking it up to a certain date with no explanation. And one of the worst things that I think is going on is the way that people are placing these phrases and such into everything they decode, and then believing that that's what they're doing. Is like, they're like, hey, let's code the Jesuits to this story, but then the next story they're like, oh, let's just code Ignatius of Loyola, or the Jesuit order this time. We'll get them. Nobody will ever figure that out. I mean, it's possible that that's going on. I'm not saying it's impossible, but it doesn't prove it until you can explain why they would do that. But once again, I feel like that all goes back to this whole idea that I have that the truth community was created on purpose, and they programmed your minds and plant seeds to make you believe that everything's the Catholics and the Jesuits and the Freemasons and so on. I mean, if you go clear back in history and you think about when you first started waking up, you learned about all of these things. You even learned about the Illuminati, which has a lot of interesting things, you know. The Illuminati was probably all part of the programming. And it's no doubt they put things in movies, and there's no doubt that there's something going on in this world that, you know, is programming our minds and such. But just because you think you're awake does not mean that you're not being programmed as well. You know, and what the exact purpose of creating a conspiracy movement and then controlling it is, I don't know, but it really, really seems that was going on. 9/11 was made very obvious, I think, for this reason. I mean, there's even the Illuminati playing cards that came out in the 90s. There's one called Conspiracy Theorists, right? So obviously they created conspiracy theorists on purpose, at least in relation to this Illuminati playing card game. Whether the Illuminati is, the Illuminati seems to be all part of the same game, you know. Think about Tupac dying by the number 7, and, you know, on the Kill Illuminati album. But the point still stands that, you know, there's a freaking card, Conspiracy Theorists, and then this was shortly before 9/11, and a bunch of series of things that went on that have created a culture, you know, a conspiracy movement. And it's interesting too, like in relation to when you look at Gematria, which I'm going to try to go back and explain why I personally follow some of these other ciphers, like the capital letter ciphers, and, you know, it explains more of why, to get a better understanding of why I decode the way I do, which a lot of people aren't doing. There's no explanation, and that's the whole point. But it's interesting when you think about all these conspiracy things, right? And then the word conspiracy does equal 51. And then you start thinking about Area 51, right? Aliens and so on. And then what was the next one? JFK. JFK in the capital letter ciphers equals 51. The word moon equals 51. If you read out 9/11 as words, it equals 51. All these big conspiracy movement things, you know, JFK, the moon landing, 9/11, they all have a connection to 51. You know, think about how the Illuminati was supposedly founded on the date 5/1. And Adam Weishaupt also equals 51, the founder of the Illuminati. So it's interesting when you look at the gematria there, do you see the connection to conspiracy and all these other big conspiracies connected to the number 51? Even things like Zeitgeist, right? Zeitgeist, the movie that awoken a lot of people to 9/11 and such, had even equals 51. Well, once again, people could question that same decoding there too, because I'm not explaining why each cipher and everything else. But I just find an interesting pattern, and I'm not completely blaming it on a cabal. I'm just saying that is an interesting pattern, that's led me to have this idea in my head, especially when you think about the Illuminati playing card called conspiracy theorist. Think about movies like The Matrix, right? Where they were teaching people to be awakened, and then like Neo's birthday, I think was a 9/11 on his passport. And this is where I'm getting at with this thing is like, if you watch these films, you find out that the people are actually, the machines actually let these people awaken, and they still control these people. So these people think that they're actually awakened and in the real world, but really the machines actually know where they are, and they destroy the city Zion every 100 years or whatever it is, and then they recreate the Matrix, right? So it's like, even though you think you are awake, you are not even awake. They still control you. And think how just after this movie came out, then we got 9/11, which supposedly, it was just made so obvious. Tons of people woke up from 9/11, all the things that didn't make sense. And it just seems like that was created on purpose to create a culture of conspiracy people and awakened people, even though the people who are awakened are still being controlled. And it wasn't too long after 9/11 that we had movies like the Da Vinci Code that came out, right? Or the book even. I remember the book coming out. But the movie, the Da Vinci Code, came out, and it was all about the Catholic conspiracy and stuff, right? And you had other people talk, other big people, whether they were doing it on purpose or if they were being led down a path to teach what they taught, like Bill Cooper and Jordan Maxwell and so on, right? You learned about these mystery schools and the Freemasons and the Catholic Church, and you learned about how all these things were bad because it feels like they were programming your mind to have these beliefs. And everywhere on the internet with conspiracy stuff, it always involves these things, So we get 9/11, then we get a movie about the Catholic conspiracy. Then we get movies like The Number 23 that came out right around that same time, which when you first watch this movie, you feel like he's just a crazy person. But I feel like they were planting seeds in people's minds as they were creating this conspiracy movement. They knew that people were going to start thinking, oh, maybe this isn't so crazy, and they start paying attention to it a little bit more, and then start studying it, and then what happens is exactly what I said. People start thinking that everything is some ritual and conspiracy, and then they start picking out all these phrases and trying to place them into these stories with no explanation. And although it does seem they can make a great presentation, it still doesn't truly prove that that is what is going on through the gematria being used. And it is interesting, Jim Carrey, he's in all kinds of stuff that is all about spiritual awakeness and such, The Truman Show, where he learns the truth of the world when Sirius, the camera, falls out of the sky, and the doctor's name is, in this movie, is Dr. Sirius Leary. And a lot of the things in this movie are synchronicities that are following him in his life. He's not really crazy, it's just synchronicities that are going on. And it's also interesting, it's the second film by the Joel Schumacher guy, and Jim Carrey was also in the other Joel Schumacher film, Batman Forever, where he's the Riddler, and the Riddler uses gematria in his riddles. And for whatever the reason, I feel like Batman was one of the reasons that lots of people woke up even more. The Dark Knight Rises theater shooting, where then they pointed to the map Sandy Hook, and then we got Hurricane Sandy right afterward in New York that reminds you of Gotham City. And then the movie The Rise of the Guardians came out, where the guy who saves them is the Sandman, who they call Sandy, and the main character is the guy who carries the hook, Sandy Hook. Then we got Sandy Hook. See, I think these things are you know, being done on purpose. I don't think that was all synchronicities and such. But just because they told us that Adam Lanza weighed 112 pounds, which makes no sense to tell us, and Sandy Hook equals 112, and he was supposed to be born on the 112th day of the year, and his initials are A and L, like 1 and 12. But that doesn't prove that they were coding it to the Jesuits who operate in 112 countries. There's no like proof behind that. It's interesting, sort of, but there's no like proof. There has to be concrete evidence. And then, people could say anything else. Like, well, the school was opened in 56, right? So people say Society of Jesus in 112 because they operate in 112 countries. It's like, well, but why didn't they choose the Society of Jesus? To me, it was probably told that he weighed 112 pounds just because Sandy Hook equal 112. And he was born on the 112th day of the year, supposedly. They must have been doing something with the number 112 that was important. We don't know for sure that it meant anything to do with the Jesuits. That's the point that I'm making. But we do know it was linked to 112 because Sandy Hook equals 112. And, think about the history of a lot of these things too. Like there's the anti-Masonic party. And this was formed out of the guy William Morgan going missing, right? William Morgan. If you read out William Morgan, his name equals the same as Freemason, right? William Morgan equals 147. And Freemason equals 147, right? It's all about the anti-Masonic party, so it makes sense to write Freemason there. What are the odds, that a guy who went against the Freemasons, his name equals the same as Freemason, and that's what, created the anti-Masonic party? And another thing a lot of people always try to do is tell us, like, stuff like, to blame it on the Jesuits. They'll say that Abe Lincoln said that it was the sinister influence of the Jesuits that created the Civil War and all that stuff. And all of that came from this Charles Chiniquy book. The guy, it was called 50 Years in the Church of Rome. And I think it was June 9th, actually. This says June 8th, but Abe Lincoln said that a span of 8 months and 4 days before his birthday, and the word Abraham Lincoln equals 84. Right? The word Jesuit equals 84. This was 8 months and 4 days before his birthday. The Civil War began in the 84th year of the United States. United States of America equals 84. Jesuit equals 84 and 42, just like Abe Lincoln. So it's pretty interesting that Abe Lincoln would, and maybe this isn't the only time, but this is a lot of what people are referring to when they say the sinister influence of the Jesuits. It all goes back to this book by Charles Chiniquy, CC, like Catholic Church, and so on, right? But even if there was more examples, what doesn't sit right with me with this example of how everything is the Jesuits, and even Abraham Lincoln blamed it on the Jesuits, is the fact that other people, he did the Gettysburg Address where he said 7 years ago. And everyone will say that he said that because of what is 47, and words such as like Republican, Democrat, White House, President, government, they all equal 47. And people will tell you the Freemason compass and squares set at 47 degrees, which isn't even true. But Euclid's 47th problem. But make this make sense to me. If Abe Lincoln was part of it because of 7 years ago, which, by the way, the Gettysburg Address, that's referring to the Independence Day, right? And if you go from the day of Independence Day to the day of the Gettysburg Address on November 19th is 139 days, a span. If you're at Freemasonry, it equals 139. But if Abe Lincoln was part of Freemasonry and he's part of the cult and so on, and then he's blaming it on the Jesuits, how does that make any sense? Why are you believing a guy who's part of the club? If he's part of the club and then he's blaming something, wouldn't you think that he's not telling the truth? It doesn't make any sense to me. Doesn't it seem as though that's something they want people to believe? And why would he be so coded? Why would him saying this, the sinister thing, be all linked up to his birthday and the Jesuits? And, if you read out, what is it? Abraham Lincoln. See, his name equals 84. If you read out just Abe Lincoln, Abe Lincoln equals 87. So why didn't he just say 87 years ago instead of 7 years ago? You know what I mean? There's just so many things that don't make sense with it. And he was super coded to being the president during the Civil War. And by the logic of everyone in the community, he said 7 years ago due to Freemasonry. But then he blames the Jesuits, and then everybody believes him. And if the Jesuits and Freemasons are under the same umbrella, then how does that make any sense? Why are you believing this guy when he says it's the Jesuits? My brain does not understand that. I cannot understand the concept of that, you know? And you know what, too? Like, there is a lot of interesting 47s, right? Like I said before, but that doesn't mean that every time there's a 47 in the news that's what it means either. You know, there has to be a connection to that in order to make it mean that. You can't just say it means Democrat, Republican, White House government, unless the story is about something involving that, you know. But if it's about, like, 47 dogs that got ran over last month, it doesn't have to mean the Freemasons were behind the story. And that's what people are doing all the time. That's why a lot of it just seems so ridiculous to other people. But one thing people always do is that they say that the Freemason square and compass is set at 47 degrees. And that all goes back to Zack pointing out, somebody sent him this picture, I think, where it says that it's measuring the tropics and it's set at 47 degrees. Because the tropics are 47 degrees apart. That might be true of this specific compass and this drawing, but what happened was we all just ran with it and nobody really ever looked into it. And when I was writing my book, I actually went and re-looked that up to research about it, and you can find zero information where the Freemason square and compass is set at 47 degrees. It's not, there's no proof at all that is a real thing. And if you get out a protractor and measure a lot of these, there's like literally no, look at, tons of these are way bigger than 47 degrees. Like there's all kinds of them that are bigger than 47 degrees. Even the one in one of Zack's books is not even 47 degrees where he's talking about it. And I'm like, the picture's not even, the compass isn't even 47 degrees in that picture. This is probably more like 60, I would think, right? I mean, there's all kinds of them that are like, they're not the same size. That is not a standard thing. So it's just interesting. I feel like we got programmed with that even. That like, I don't know where this picture came from, but I feel like somebody gave us this picture to help us, to lead us along to have this belief about that, you know? I mean, it is interesting with Euclid, you know, the Pythagorean theorem and such, and the 47th problem of Euclid about foundation and whatever else, but people got to quit saying this about the 47 degrees on the Masonic square and compass, because it's not true. And even if it was true, it doesn't prove that every time there's a 47 in a news story that that's what it means. Hopefully that makes sense, but another controlled conspiracy thing is this the Tim Russert interview, right? Tim Russert, the guy who asked George Bush and John Kerry about skull and bones and the number 322. But I don't feel like this guy was exposing anything. I feel like all of this was planned. It was all over YouTube for a very long time, and now it's very hard to find. And I think they did it for a reason, to make people think that it was something that was very significant. And now they make things hard to find that were all over YouTube for years. It wasn't hard to find, but in these capital letter ciphers, if you write out Tim Russert, his name just so happens to equal 322. Right? Just like the number that he was questioning George Bush and John Kerry about. Right? The skull and bones number. Let's just point it out really quick. Skull and bones. Right? The order 322. So it's interesting in the capital letter cipher, which I'll explain in a little while, why I started using this cipher. But in relation to the Jesuits and how everybody always thinks it's the Jesuits, if you write out skull and bones in these capital letter ciphers just so happens to equal 201. That number everybody associates with the Jesuits. And Tim Russert died on the day leaving 201 days in the year. So his name equals 322. He dies on the day leaving 201 days in the year. Skull and bones in that same cipher equals 201. And I recently discovered a whole bunch of stuff in relation to the composite numbers, which I've explained in the previous video and a bunch of other videos why I've been paying attention to the composite numbers recently. But in the composites, the 322nd composite is 402. And notice if you write out skull and bones, it equals 402, and that's the capital letter ciphers. And if you write out Meet the Press, that Tim Russert said that on, that the show's name was Meet the Press, and the composite cipher, it equals 255, and the 255th composite is 322. George Walker Bush equals 255, and the word composite equals 255. In relation to 402, remember right after 9/11, George Bush came to Offutt Air Force Base in the 402 area code. But the point I want to make is, that Tim Russert equals 322, and then Skull and Bones has this connection to 201. And, look at Tim Russert. Tim Russert, he went to a Jesuit high school. It was a Jesuit high school. And then he went to the Jesuit University of John Carroll. So in the logic that is being used all of the time in this truth community in Gematria, that makes Tim Russert a Jesuit. Even though he's not a Jesuit, he just was Jesuit educated. So if Tim Russert is a Jesuit and is part of the system, and he's exposing Skull and Bones, don't you think that that was being done on purpose? Especially when his name equals 322? And then once again, Skull and Bones, it's modeled after the Knights Templar, which goes back to the Catholic Church, which is all under the same umbrella. So why are they exposing themselves? It makes no sense at all. Why are we thinking that Tim Russert is some good guy when really Tim Russert was doing exactly what he was supposed to be doing? The way I see it, seems like Tim Russert, all that was planned. And they got people to start looking into Skull and Bones, once again, to move along the conspiracy movement that they created. It seems to be part of the programming. All part of the programming. That, that's why they put in a guy like Donald Trump, who's all about the conspiracy theories, and it really is, super divided the country. They drop out coronavirus around that time. And, people have been talking about vaccines and the conspiracy movement for years. Then all of a sudden they want to do a vaccine. And, it seems to be just all super controlled. Everything that you think you're awake of, it was all supposed for you to be that way. You're not really awake. It's just like the movie The Matrix. They created a group of people that are awake, but yet they still control your thoughts and your mind. And don't forget how we learned about Event 201, right? Remember Event 201, the coronavirus pandemic exercise and so on? We learned about that from a guy who went to a Jesuit university, Dr. Paul Cottrell, whose name equals 201, and he kept calling Zack while Zack was in Louisiana, that equals 201, and he was staying in room 201, and this guy kept calling him, and then he called him and telling him about Event 201, and that guy's name equaled 201, and he went to a Jesuit university. And then the first video that he made with Zack was one where he used the thumbnail of the umbrella, and the umbrella represents mind control. Now, you could say it was because of Resident Evil and so on, but maybe I'll explain the umbrella symbolism again in a little bit. There's a big thing with umbrella symbolism and all around Zack, and it's just interesting in relation to how Fritz Springmeier says that the umbrella represents mind control to the elite and so on, right? So right after Dr. Paul Cottrell calls, and we're talking about coronavirus and Revelation, and then people notice that Pope Francis's full name equals 201, and all these connections to the Jesuits in 201. Then we get Anthony Fauci, who was Jesuit educated, and Gavin Newsom, who was Jesuit educated, and Donald Trump. It seems like they started doing stories on purpose to make us believe they were connected to the Jesuits, right? And then we started using these phrases that we were programmed our minds to with every single story because they were controlling us to have this belief that everything was the Jesuits. I mean, isn't that interesting? That has stuck out to me forever. So we're calling out the Jesuits all because of Event 201 and the connection to 201, and we learn about all that because of a guy who went to a Jesuit school whose name equals 201 calls Zack, right? It doesn't sit right with me. In relation to the umbrella symbolism as well, I started noticing the pattern with the umbrella symbolism in December of 2016. And in December of 2016, this is when Zack had started a website called All for Truth. And the logo that was used was this umbrella, right? The umbrella, and it was All for Truth, and a whole bunch of things with this. Just after he started this website, there was a guy named the Umbrella Man on YouTube who told Zack to watch out for Christmas Eve. Then a car crashed through Zack's garage on Christmas Eve. I'll go into detail a little bit more, but there was an umbrella symbolism thing that was going on. And then just a couple weeks after all of that, my uncle, who was a 4th degree Knight of Columbus, ended up dying in a mysterious car crash that really makes no sense. He was coming back from Minnesota, and he went off the main highway in the wrong direction out on a gravel road and wrecked his car or truck. And then he ended up dying at the Jesuit hospital Creighton the very next day. And because of that, I also got a letter in the mail that was express shipped with $300 in it, basically telling me to just believe in God and stop making videos and stuff. I want to go back and review that. Maybe I'm mistaken. Maybe I took it as that at the time, but it's just interesting on the very same day that my uncle dies at the Jesuit hospital that I get a letter in the mail that was express shipped, and they sent me $300 and so on, And because of that, I started thinking that a lot of, everything was the Jesuits. So the umbrella symbolism does go back to the Jesuits and the Catholic Church symbolism. And the original Umbrella Man actually comes from the JFK assassination. And of course, think about JFK being Catholic and JFK dying after meeting the Pope. So it could be connected to the Catholic Church. I'm not saying that I know for sure the Catholic Church isn't the secret cabal or whatever, but because it's obvious the Catholic Church has some role in it, but I just don't think they're the top of the chain, for one. I don't think the Jesuits are the top of the chain. And it also doesn't dismiss the way that people are decoding, taking all of them phrases that are connected to the cabal and then just placing them every time they see it, that's programmed. It doesn't change the fact that people are decoding in ways that don't have an explanation. So I'm not saying that the Catholic Church isn't, I feel like they probably are involved with it somehow and some way, but it doesn't take away from what I said earlier in the video about the way people are decoding. And it's also very confusing when you have, things like Abraham Lincoln, who is obviously part of the system, but then calls out the Jesuits, and it's like, well, that's confusing. And then you got guys like Tim Russert, who everybody thinks was some good guy for exposing Skull and Bones, but then Tim Russert also went to a Jesuit high school at a Jesuit university, and all of that was all by the numbers. And then you get learning about Event 201 from Dr. Paul Cottrell, who also went to a Jesuit university. And then we learn a whole bunch more about the connection to the Jesuits. It almost just seems like there was something that is guiding us to have that belief, which makes me think that it's not the Jesuits, even though it's sort of interrelated into it. Or maybe it was built that way on purpose. Maybe that's part of the mind control, But also in relation to explaining why I use certain ciphers, and a lot of people in the community are using certain ciphers, it seems to stem back to the same symbolism from 2016. Because, originally we had used just these two ciphers, right? The simple gematria and also the reduction gematria. And like I said, there's examples like Osama bin Laden, how he equals 47 and 110. The Twin Towers were 110 stories tall. The Building 7 was 47 stories tall. Interesting things like that is what we had showed. But around the time of this umbrella symbolism, that is when, so, Donald Trump ended up becoming the president, and everybody was following Hillary Clinton to be the president. So Donald Trump became the president. And then right after the umbrella symbolism stuff, and on Christmas Eve, actually, the day that Zack's house or garage got crashed into, after the umbrella man told him to watch out for Christmas Eve, that same day, the Colts were eliminated from making the playoffs, right? So the Colts couldn't even go to the Super Bowl. And that was another thing that we were following, was the Colts to be in the Super Bowl. And a lot of people, you got to think about this, back in the time, that was the first time people were starting to talk about how maybe they were flipping the script with these things, right? Flipping the script. And even earlier in that year, there was a story about Andrew Luck, the quarterback for the Indianapolis Colts, and how he was still using a flip phone in 2016. So you knew there was some weird thing going on with flipping. And then around that same time, Derek had started working on these other ciphers, and he and some other people, and they started studying the reverse method of Gematria, right? So like flipping the Gematria. And due to flipping and being a theme kind of, I started thinking about football, and my uncle Barney, who had died just after that, he had gave me a Dan Marino jersey out of nowhere. It just appeared on my porch one day, and I didn't know who gave it to me. I thought like my friends gave it to me as a joke. But he left a Dan Marino jersey on my porch, and the Dolphins were still, in contention of possibly making the Super Bowl, and so on. And I started thinking about the Dolphins and how Flipper is a dolphin. So maybe there was something important to Flipper and the flipping theme, and maybe there was something important to the Dolphins. And then my uncle ends up dying, and it still to this day doesn't really make that much sense to me, the story that I was told. But I had noticed all of these things with my uncle when he died. Like, everything about him was the number 166. His name even equaled 166. And his wife was named Betty, which reminded you of the Flintstones. They even had a Flintstones-themed wedding. And when I looked up the Flintstones, it said they aired 166 episodes. And it was based on a show called The Honeymooners. And if you read out Honeymooners, it equaled 166. And one day I asked my mom what my Uncle Barney's birthday was, and the day that she told me just happened to be 166 days after his birthday. And I found that out at the Gold Slipper where my mom was working that equaled 166. And there was just all these 166s. And then I started looking into the reverse ciphers because they were kind of brand new and such, and flipping the script. And if you write out reverse Gematria, it just so happened to equal 166. Another thing that was interesting was the fact that a few months after my uncle died, I kept getting comments from this guy named James Jumper on my blog, just talking crap. And then I realized that this person had made a blog that was mocking my blog, Mindless Freaks spelled a little different. And what had started this blog was because right before the Umbrella Man stuff, I was making all of these videos about this lady named Cindy Stowell on Jeopardy and how everything about her was by the numbers. And when I go back and think about it, this guy made a lot of good points on his blog about the way I was decoding, because I was decoding in the way that I'm telling people not to decode now, because it doesn't make that much sense. And, it's just interesting. I was talking all about Jeopardy. Around the same time, I was also talking about a theme with JJ. There was a lot of JJ stuff going on in the news. So I just thought it was interesting that this guy would be named James Jumper, and he started this blog right around the same time I started talking about Flipper and my uncle giving me the Dan Marino jersey and such. And I noticed if you write out James Jumper just so happens to equal 166 and the reverse method. And further, if you go and look at this person's blog, when they first started it, they deleted the post now. But if you go and looked at it, he referred to me as Nad. He kept calling me Nad instead of Dan, which is my name, and reverse, right? So I knew something was guiding us to pay attention to the reverse methods of Gematria and the reverse ciphers. And that is why I started paying attention to the reverse ciphers, because you just can't make this stuff up. Somebody names James Jumper equals 166 in the reverse, and you don't notice how they equal 41, and look at Jeopardy. Right? Jeopardy equals 41 in the reverse. So after I discovered this guy had a blog, and the connections to 166 and reverse Gematria, it made me seem like that flipping the script was actually part of the actual script. And they were, something was trying to control us and get us to start following the reverse ciphers. So I made a video talking all about the number 166. And then a couple days after that, the Umbrella Man, the guy with the Umbrella Man who told Zack to watch out for Christmas Eve, he ended up making a new video, and he told Zack that he should watch out for the numbers 166. And that video just so happened to be 166 days after my birthday. Even if you go to Zack's old blog, he talks about that video, and he mentions how it was interesting that I had just made a video all about the number 166, and now the Umbrella Man is making the video all about the number 166. That turned out to be 166 days after my birthday. It seemed as though that video was made for me to see. And another thing that I was talking about in that video was the connection to the angel Gabriel. There was all these things with my uncle dying that was related to the angel Gabriel and the book of Daniel 10:12. And my Uncle Barney's father, which was my grandpa, his birthday also just so happened to be 10/12. And his name equaled 166 in the reverse method. And 10/12 is the day in history that Christopher Columbus supposedly discovered America. And once again, my uncle was a 4th degree Knight of Columbus, so it made me think of that connection to, the Catholic Church and so on. Further, my Uncle Barney went and saw Pope Benedict in Washington, D.C. when he was in Washington, D.C. And then just after that, his wife won $250,000 on a lottery ticket. But when he went there, he got some medal or medallion blessed by Pope Benedict. And my other uncle, the first uncle on my mom's side to die, Kelly Murphy, whose name equals 166, my Uncle Barney actually buried that medallion with my Uncle Kelly. So I thought, he's the first one to die, and then he gets this thing with the Catholic Church, and his name even equals 166. And then my Uncle Barney's name 166, their father's name 166. But the moral of the story is, when I made that video about 166, I was talking about the angel Gabriel and how I thought it was interesting because the angel Gabriel only goes to Daniel in the Bible, Daniel, and he also tells Zechariah that he will birth Jesus, or John the Baptist, right? So he goes to Daniel, Zechariah, and also Mary, and tells Mary that she's going to birth Jesus Christ, right? So I was thinking about how my name is Daniel, Zach's name is Zechariah, and I was wondering if there was a truth seeker named Mary that might show up. And a couple nights later, on Zach's radio show, The Gematria Effect, this lady named Mary Toffelmeyer called in. This is her channel, Mary Toffelmeyer, and she starts telling him about how she is the Umbrella Man's next victim, and he was trying to hurt her pet pig. And this was interesting because as I was listening to this, I was sitting next to 2 stuffed animal pigs that my daughter called her pets before she went to bed. And she told me to watch her pet pigs. And then I'm listening to this radio show, and this lady calls in talking about how she's the next victim of the Umbrella Man, and her name is Mary. And I was like, what are the odds of that? I'm sitting next to these pet pigs, and she said he's trying to hurt her pet pig, and that he's a pig. And then I typed out her name in Gematria, Mary Toffelmeyer, and her name equaled 166. So once again, it made me think that that video about 166 was for sure made in relation to me. And even more interesting is the Umbrella Man then made some post that said DBSFAPR 17 or something like that. And this video was made in April of 17, but these are my initials, Dan Barrett, right? And April 17th, the next year, my Uncle Clancy died. My next uncle on my Uncle Barney's side to die. My mom had 8 brothers and sisters, but the next uncle or the next relative on that side of the family that died died on April 17th. And I was like, what are the odds of that? Especially when I'm talking about how it's connected to my other uncles who died. And then that guy makes a post and it has that date on there. Then my next uncle dies on that date. So hopefully that makes sense. This is why I've been following the reverse ciphers ever since. It all stemmed back to this umbrella symbolism. It's almost like something was guiding us to pay attention to the reverse ciphers. And ever since, I've been paying attention. This is the reason why I still use these ciphers to this day. In relation to the Francis Bacon or the capital letter ciphers, these ones important to capital letters, the reason I am following them has to do with the same symbolism, the same umbrella symbolism. If you go back to 2019, so in 2019, there was all kinds of stuff that was going on with the date 310, right? There was the Ethiopian airline crash, and 3 months and 10 days in November of 2018, I was talking about this theme with Buffy the Vampire Slayer that was all about the number 310, and then 3 months and 10 days later, on March 4th, 2019, Luke Perry died. Luke Perry was the boyfriend of Buffy on the film Buffy the Vampire Slayer. There was all this stuff with the number 310 that was going on in the news in March of 2019. But then on March 22nd, I was DJing at a bar called Cheers, and I had a synchronicity with Chigozie Truth. I was just sitting there DJing, and I went to Facebook, and the first post that brought me up was one about Chigozie Truth had a post about Clay Matthews, the Green Bay Packers football player, right? And I thought this was funny because this post was from March 20th, and I was DJing on March 22nd. So this post, Facebook gave me this post from 2 days ago about Clay Matthews, but on the wall right behind me where I'm DJing is a big picture of Clay Matthews, and I thought that was interesting. And there's a whole bunch of stuff with it, like Clay Matthews equals 150, the bars in Dow City, Iowa that equals 150, and just on the other part of the wall, like, so I'm DJing over here, and on the wall over here, there's this big sign that says Dow City, Iowa, 150th. They were going to be celebrating their 150th anniversary. So I was like, that's crazy. The two big things on the wall with this bar are the number 150 and then Clay Matthews. And it links up to my synchronicity with Chigozie Truth's post on Facebook. And then I just started doing a little more research, and I noticed that my friend who owned the bar, if you wrote out his name in Gematria, his name just so happened to equal 310. And I was like, that's interesting. There must be something to do with Cheers and how it relates to all of this. And a couple of days later, I was at work, and somebody had a lottery ticket that they cashed in, and they didn't sign the ticket, and they left. So I just randomly wrote Mary Poppins. I have no idea why I wrote Mary Poppins. Sometimes I write Barack Obama. I write a bunch of fake names on there. But that particular day, I wrote Mary Poppins. And the very next person that came in after I wrote Mary Poppins on the back of this ticket was somebody wearing a shirt that said Supercalifragilisticexpialidocious, which was a play on Mary Poppins. I was like, what are the odds I wrote Mary Poppins, and now the next customer that comes in is wearing a shirt that's connected to Mary Poppins? And I still wasn't even really thinking about the umbrella symbolism at the time in relation to the old umbrella symbolism, but you'll think about Mary Poppins and the umbrella. But I searched my blog for Mary Poppins, and I noticed that I had talked about Mary Poppins and the 166th episode. I don't know why I wrote that in here, but I talked about Mary Poppins in the 166th episode of The Simpsons. And I thought that's interesting with the umbrella stuff because of 166 and Mary Poppins. And then I was like, I wonder what season 3 episode 10 is, because I've been following that number 310. And when I looked up season 3 episode 10 of The Simpsons, the episode was called Flaming Moe's, and it was a parody of the TV show Cheers. So it seemed there was something important to the TV show Cheers that I was supposed to see. And just a few days later, there was a mainstream media article about how the Big Bang Theory was going to surpass the TV show Cheers with the most episodes on a TV show or whatever it was, the longest running multi-camera sitcom. So the Big Bang Theory was going to surpass Cheers. That was one of the stories in the news. And, I was talking all about Buffy the Vampire Slayer with the number 310 and such, and I started saying how this was connected to that. And the very last episode of the Big Bang Theory that aired, the whole joke was a joke about Buffy the Vampire Slayer, the whole episode. So I knew that it was important to this same thing. But moral of the story is, I'm having synchronicity with Cheers, and then Cheers is in the news about getting surpassed by the Big Bang Theory. And then we also had a story about some guy in Turkey who was holding strong winds came and pulled his hot dog cart or whatever it was up into the air that had an umbrella on it, and they compared it to Mary Poppins. Mary Poppins, right? Strong winds and man soaring into the air like Mary Poppins. So I knew there was something going on with umbrella symbolism and how it was related to that synchronicity with Cheers. And then a few days after that, Zack was doing a live stream and it got hacked with porn. Right? So Zack's live stream got hacked with porn and it got taken down. And I was just thinking about, Zack getting hacked and how the umbrella symbolism brought me back to when the umbrella man made the video, telling him to watch out for Christmas Eve, and then a car crashed through his garage and so on. So I was like, there must be something going on with this umbrella symbolism again. Zack even got a strike on that video, and his strike lasted until the date June 28th. And if you go back to 2016 when the umbrella symbolism stuff was going on, Zack's house got crashed into, and then 186 days later, they took his first ever channel down on June 28th. June 28th is the day that leaves 186 days in the year. And at the time, Zack made one more episode of his Truth Frequency radio show on the 186th day of the year, just after this happening, and then he took a 2-week break. So I thought there was something important to that 186. And if you look up the Umbrella Man, it stems back to JFK and such. His name is Louis Witt. Louis Witt, his name equals 186. Louis Witt. Louis Stephen Witt, his name, if you write it out as Louis Stephen Witt, it also equals 186. So moral of the story is, that strike lasting until the day leaving 186 days in the year, it made it seem like there was something important to the umbrella symbolism again. And it wasn't soon after this, right around the same time, a big thing I was following with the Big Bang Theory and Cheers and such was the number 328 and the number 314. And Zenith of the Alpha had pointed out in relation to the Francis Bacon ciphers, that's what we called them at the time, now we call them the capital letter ciphers or whatever, but he showed me that in these ciphers there was all of these connections to them numbers with them ciphers, like the Big Bang Theory equaled 328. And 73, which is Sheldon's favorite number, if you write it out with the capital letter cipher, it equals 314. And if you write out 310, that big number I was following, it equals 314. There was a new show called Young Sheldon. Young Sheldon equaled 328. Look at all these, you can see them all. There was just all of these interesting connections to that cipher, the capital letter cipher. And it was also a Chinese pig year, right? And a big thing, 2019 was a Chinese pig year. And I started thinking about Francis Bacon and thinking about how bacon and pigs. So maybe there was a reason that these ciphers were important at that time. And it reminded me that we had learned about the reverse cipher and the importance in relation to the umbrella symbolism. Now I'm seeing the umbrella symbolism again. And now I'm seeing the connections to these other ciphers that involve capital letters that we called Francis Bacon. And it was a Chinese pig year. So it all kind of made sense. So I started paying attention to these ciphers, giving them to see if they were relevant as the year went on. And it just never seemed to stop. they were very relevant to everything that I started following ever since then. They've been super relevant, these important ciphers. And another thing that was really interesting was around this same time, we had Jeopardy was a big thing again. There was this guy named Jeopardy James, whose birthday's now changed again. But at one point, Wikipedia said that his birthday was the same day as my Uncle Barney's birthday, which I thought was interesting. Now it's August 6th, which is connected to my book, a date I've been talking a whole lot about this year. So that's interesting too. But his name, they called him Jeopardy James, right? JJ. And think back about the umbrella symbolism and the James Jumper guy, JJ, and how I was blogging about a theme with JJ right around the time of that originally noticing the umbrella symbolism. So this guy was really big. And I started thinking, you know what? Maybe all of this is, maybe we're supposed to learn this, the capital letter ciphers. Maybe this is the new thing with the umbrella symbolism. It's guiding me to learn these ciphers. And sure enough, these ciphers were super duper relevant. I mean, they've never stopped being relevant. I have like countless blog posts where I'm talking about these ciphers and how they're absolutely related. And then later we got like the capital insurrection, right? The capital insurrection. And, you know, whatever, capital insurrection. Just think about that in relation to capital letters. And then we discovered all kinds of stuff, or, you know, other people did too. But other people pointed a bunch of stuff out. Like Zenith was pointing out how Donald Trump touched the Western Wall at 4:24 p.m. And if you write out Donald Trump in all capital letters, Donald Trump equals 424. You know, so there's a whole lot more to it, but these ciphers have been absolutely relevant ever since 2019, at least for me. And that is the reason that I started paying attention to these ciphers and using them, because there was a reason for it. And I mean, in relation to the umbrella symbolism, look at Zack's name and these Francis Bacon ciphers. It equals 186. Remember how they deleted his channel on the day leaving 186 days in the year, 186 days after a car crashed into his garage? Zack's wife's name, her real name even equals 186 in these ciphers. And for years, he never told us that they were even married, but they ended up getting married on December 15th. I can't remember what year it was. I thought 2018, but December 15th just so happens to be the day that All for Truth launched. And All for Truth had the umbrella logo right before the umbrella man told him to watch out for Christmas Eve, and then a car crashed through his garage. And there's been all kinds of stuff in relation to that number, 186, around Zack. Remember how Cooper Cup was all synced up to Zack? Cooper Cup equals 186, and Cooper Cup's grandpa ended up buying Zack's old house, and all kinds of stuff. And remember how Dr. Paul Cottrell was reaching out to Zack while he was in Louisiana? Like I said, Louisiana equals 201 in the capital ciphers. And Zack was staying at room 201, and Dr. Paul Cottrell, who went to a Jesuit school whose name equals 201, was the guy telling him about Event 201, and that's what sparked the whole thing about Pope Francis and the Jesuits and 201. But when he was reaching out to Zack, Zack was staying at this hotel, however you pronounce it, the Trim A or the Trim. But notice that equals 186. And, I mean, there's all kinds of stuff that has related to this. I've made tons of other videos on it. But, you know, Zack was born on the day that Neil Armstrong walked on the moon and stuff, right? And it's interesting because, like, Neil Armstrong equals 186, and 628 is Elon Musk's birthday, right? Think about space with Elon Musk. His name equals 186. SpaceX equals 186. Think about Jeff Bezos and space and 186, and Seattle. And Amazon was founded on the 186th day of the year. There was even a story a while back about Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk, and one of them surpassed the other one, and it was like 186 days after the 186th day of the year, the day Amazon was founded. And remember all the truth rallies that were going on in 2022, where they went to Oklahoma City and that was inspired by news articles and such, right? Once again, like, I'm telling you, programming that what led to do that. And then after they went to Oklahoma City, they randomly went to the JFK assassination site where the umbrella symbolism stems from. And then 9/11, well, there was the Buffalo one, but the biggest one that was going to go on that year was the 9/11 Truth Rally. And on 9/11, all of the live streams, there was umbrellas everywhere. It was raining in New York, and I've never seen that many umbrellas in my entire life. All these videos had umbrellas in them. And I was like, see, I told you, it is connected to this umbrella symbolism. All of these truth rallies seem to be, it would seem to be manipulated and done on purpose. Like, maybe Zack didn't even realize, but it seemed to be what they were supposed to be doing. And the very next day, the guy who has the Umbrella Man channel on a different one of his channels, he made a video called Skull and Bones. And then Zack, that was the same day Zack went to Skull and Bones in Yale, right? Or he went to Yale to educate about Skull and Bones and such. I'm like, how interesting the Umbrella Man channel has a different channel. He makes a video called Skull and Bones the same day Zack goes to Skull and Bones, and it just so happened to be Andrew Luck's 33rd birthday. And remember, everything about the whole All for Truth and everything in Zack's life is all about this number 33. His first ever blog post on Free to Find Truth is 3 months and 3 days after his birthday. And when he started a GoFundMe for All for Truth, he was trying to raise $33,000 when he was 33 years old. And then the car ended up crashing into his garage. Garage equals 33 after the Umbrella Man told him to watch out for Christmas Eve. He used to be a teacher, right? Teacher equals 33. The master teacher number is 33. When the car crashed into his garage, Zack was in Oregon, right? The 33rd state. The police officer who signed off on it, on the report, signed off on the 33rd minute of the day, and the word police equals 33. Once again, think how garage equals 33, right after he was trying to raise $33,000 when he was age 33. The car that crashed into Zack's garage, that happened 156 days after Zack's birthday. And that's interesting because for years he talked about how if you write out 33, it equals 156. His wife, he still calls her Sweet Lady. Sweet Lady equals 33. Her birthday is 3 months and 3 days before the Jesuit anniversary. Remember the day that Zack's garage got crashed into, the Colts were eliminated from the playoffs? And the Colts were eliminated by a team who scored 33 points. That's why it was so interesting when the Umbrella Man guy made the video called Skull and Bones on Andrew Luck's 33rd birthday while Zack was at Yale right after the 9/11 rally where there was umbrellas everywhere. It's very interesting. But I mean, like, why aren't these things being shown, There, a while back when he was trying to disprove or whatever, he was talking about, he was on Chaotic Truths, whatever, and they were showing the Mike Tyson fight, and he was pointing out how the big G of Gatorade at the Mike Tyson fight means Freemasons, right? The Masonic rituals and all this stuff. Well, it's interesting, but you don't know that for sure. I mean, it might just be for Gatorade or whatever, but I mean, really, it doesn't prove anything. It's interesting, but when you apply it to your own life, when his house was crashed into, he made the video, and the big thing that was shown when he was showing the garage is the big letter G that was on the siding or whatever it is, the insulation or whatever this is, right? But look at that, the big letter G. And in the Francis Bacon ciphers, the capital letter ciphers, the big letter G just so happens to equal 33. And this might sound ridiculous, but if you go from the day of modern Freemasonry's founding date to the day that his house was crashed into or his garage was crashed into, it's 184 days. And if you write out Freemasonry and the capital letter ciphers, it equals 184. Just like if you write out Catholic Church, it equals 184. Think about Catholic Church and 33. C is the third letter. CC 33. Christopher Columbus. I mean, the list just goes on and on and on. All for Truth. It started 3 months and 3 days after Andrew Luck's birthday. Zack had a logo for the longest time the logo on his channels said the word truth, or it said Gematria effect. That's what it was. Gematria effect. And notice how there's only shading in the I, the A, the C, and the T. If you write out IACT, it just so happens to equal 33. Remember the Oklahoma City rallies? The Oklahoma City rally on 4/19 that was 3 months and 3 days before Zack's birthday. And it had all to do with this stuff that happened in January in the news. And it was the Texas hostage crisis. And it reminded him of David Koresh and Timothy McVeigh. And they both died at the age of 33. And then when Zack made the video to have a truth rally on April 19th in Oklahoma City, the video was 33 minutes long. And then when he got there, the band Primus was playing, and Primus equals 33. I mean, during them rallies, Zack even met Derek for the first time of the Gematrinator in real life, 3 months and 3 days after Derek's birthday. And there is a lot of 33 stuff that goes along with Zack, you know. It's just insane. And I don't get why people aren't talking about this. So we're always trying to expose all the Freemasons and such, but yet we're just leaving out all of these 33s that are around Zack that happen. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. I mean, just pointed out where he was trying to raise $33,000. He launched All for Truth 147 days after his birthday. If this was any other story, they'd say Freemason and conspiracy and Gematria equal 147. But since it's to Zack, then we don't care about it. You know, I don't understand this at all. These things need to be, you know, if you start talking about these things, it starts making doing it within the news stories kind of irrelevant because it's happening all over the place. I didn't mean to go on this whole rant either. It's just, I don't know, it came up within the umbrella symbolism. So it's like, here we go. And I had it all in this other thing, but, you know, his first blog post on All for Truth, or on Free to Find Truth, 3 months, 3 days after his birthday. Which is also October 24th is the day that, according to his blog, was the day that Richard Hofstadter died, and he's the guy who coined the term conspiracy theory, and he died 2 months and 18 days after his birthday. His final birthday was on the 218th day of the year. Zack launched All for Truth 218 days before his birthday. If you write out the word conspiracy theory, it equals 218. It's also 1024, the first blog post, is also the day that leaves 68 days in the year. If we were doing a story in the news, everyone would write CIA equals 68, right? And Zachary K. Hubbard, the way he used to have his name on YouTube, also equals 68. You know? His middle initial, using his middle initial too. He's explained this before, but I just have always found that interesting. Using his middle initial that is a master number in his name, and a guy who is like sharing stuff about numbers or whatever, and uses the master number, which so happens to be his middle name, or his middle letter, and then he ends up naming his daughter's middle name 11. Which, whatever, you know, I named my kid Alistair, but it's still interesting, you know? Remember when Amazon decided to put Zack's book on Amazon, 9/11 to Coronavirus, and they did it on October 13th? That's the day that the Pope who approved the Jesuits became the Pope, October 13th. That's also the day in history the Knights Templar were wiped out. And there's a whole bunch more to that as well, like 1013 is the 170th prime number, and if you write out Zack's full name, it equals 117 if you write out number games. Or 170. If you write out number games, it equals 170. All kinds of stuff. But in relation to 33, remember, after his book release, there was a news story about Antifa being at Powell's bookstore or something like that. So Zack went to educate about Andy No and such. And it just so happened Andy No was releasing this book on the 33rd day of the year. So he was going to go try to expose Andy No and all this. But he just so happened to go there 3 months and 3 days after his own book released. to talk about Powell's, or go to Powell's that equals 33, and go there to talk about this guy's book who released on the 33rd day of the year, 3 months and 3 days after his own book released on Amazon. And of course, it was on the 16th day of the year, and if you read out 16, it equals 33, and Powell's was in the 33rd state, Oregon, and their books released 16 weeks apart, right? Whereas 16 equals 33. Book equals 16. He went there on the 16th day of the year, which was 116, like how Portland equals 116 where it was. And then, I don't want to go into the big old thing, but he also got bear sprayed, which is like the first time I ever heard of that before. And the only other time I heard of it was when they said that Brian Sicknick at the Capitol insurrection supposedly got bear sprayed. And the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone was also synced up to Zack and so on in Seattle with the umbrella symbol logo that I'll skip over, but they used an umbrella logo and it was all linked up to Zack. But right after the Andy No stuff, a week later or so, Zack made a video talking about why he called his girlfriend Sweet Lady, and it had to do with the Tyrese song. But remember, Sweet Lady equals 33, and Sweet Lady just so happens to be originally from Myanmar. And then the very next day, or a couple days later, there was the Myanmar coup that happened. It's like, what are the odds of that? He's talking about Sweet Lady and 33, and then there's a Myanmar coup. And that was all linked up to the numbers of Zack and so on, the number 170. And then a few months after this, there was a story about Winston from the band Mumford & Sons and how he supported Andy No, so he was going to leave the band or something of the sort. And that just happened to be 33 weeks exactly after Zack's birthday. And I pointed out how, for years, Zack has pointed out about the book 1984 and the main character being Winston, and how Winston equals 33. And of course, 1984 was written by George Orwell. That's what it reminded me of. And then a few months later, I found out that Sweet Lady was actually born on the same day as George Orwell. And George Orwell used to be from Myanmar, or Burma. And he has, you know what I mean? It's just like, it's ridiculous. It's absolutely crazy. All these 33s, but we're not talking about any of these 33s. Not paying attention to any of these things going on. Cooper Kupp, right? And was the Super Bowl MVP, and he was from Yakima, where Zack had lived at the time that he was a Super Bowl MVP. And then Cooper Kupp's grandpa goes on and buys Zack's house. And his grandpa and his birthdays are 3 months and 3 days apart, and Yakima equals 33. There's so many things. It's just... Right after the OKC rally, the next rally was the one in Buffalo that was 33 days after the OKC rally. And then the next one was in 9/11 in New York, and New York equals 33. And a whole bunch of stuff with that Buffalo rally as well, how it linked up to the Buffalo Bills and Skull and Bones, and Josh Allen equals 33. And, think about that back with Andrew Luck and the connection to the Umbrella Man making the video on the 33rd birthday of Andrew Luck. He also started Wake the Fuck Up Radio last year on the date 3/3, and the first episode was all about the number 33. Obviously, he did that on purpose, but still interesting. That was also by the numbers of Aleister Crowley that I talked about in 418 and such, but back in November, after he did a video on Chaotic Truth, he did a video where ChatGPT was asked about his research with Gematria, right? He did a video about ChatGPT right after that, and ChatGPT just so happens to equal 33. And then, let's see if I put it in here, but after he made that video about ChatGPT, right, and the number 33, not too long after that, we got the story about ChatGPT whistleblower Suchir Balaji and how they died or whatever. And they died the same day that Zack brought up the Chat GPT. So the same day Zack made the video about Chat GPT and his research, a guy from a whistleblower of Chat GPT died. And they didn't announce it until later. So he actually died on the same day Zack made this video. And they didn't announce it until like a couple weeks later in December. But if you look into the story, they found him dead on November 26th, the same day he put that video up. That story came to the news 146 days after Zack's birthday. If you read out Chat GPT, it equals 146. And also 224. If you read out Zack Hubbard, it equals 146. And if you read out the guy who whistleblowed or died, his name equals 224. So 146 days after Zack's birthday, Chat GPT equals 146. Zack Hubbard equals 146. See, it's completely coded to him. And the big thing about it was that he had did this interview whistleblowing them on October 23rd, and then he ended up dying in November. So that was like a conspiracy thing or whatever, right? But if you went from Zack's birthday to that interview, it's a span of 3 months and 3 days. And he was whistleblowing about Chat GPT that equals 33, and another one called Open AI that equals 33. Like, why are we not talking about these things, It drives me crazy that everybody else will decode all these things about other people and decode things in the news and say it means these things. But then when it happens to Zack over and over, it never gets looked into. It's always overlooked. It's there's more to it. There's something going on here. And, in his video about that guy dying, he actually messed up and said that October 23rd was the day leaving 68 days in the year. And he went on to think about how it was connected to Space Odyssey that came out in 68. But then he realized that October 23rd is the day that leaves 69 days of the year, and he had made an error. So then he's like, oh, that means the Jesuit order and Illuminati. And it's like, well, see, it's just proof that that you're programmed with these phrases and words, and then you're just connecting them however you feel the need to connect them with no real explanation of why that is important and why they would choose that certain thing. Because originally it was like, oh man, it's because of Space Odyssey. But then when you realize you made the error, now it's the Illuminati and the Jesuit order, But I'm going to leave the video there. Like I said, I didn't want to go on the big old thing with 33. And there's tons more of 33. There's way more to explain with it. The umbrella symbolism. But the moral of the story is there's something going on. There's some type of mind control thing. And that might even involve me. You know what I mean? Like, maybe all the umbrella symbolism is somehow, like I said, maybe they're using me for a certain reason as well. I don't disagree with that. But there's a lot of things that don't make sense. And it still doesn't take away from the fact of the way that a lot of people are decoding that it doesn't make sense. And it's not consistent. But like I said, the umbrella symbolism is wild. There's something to do with it. Mind control and how it works. And the umbrella symbolism always seems to come up whenever we learn a new cipher and such. And in relation to the Julian calendar too, back in 2019, after I learned the Francis Bacon ciphers and such, a big thing that we were following was August 11th and Tisha B'Av. But I was pointing out how I thought there was going to be a division within the truth community, because that's what 2016 that seemed like they were trying to do, was divide the truth community and such. And I thought it was going to be connected to that event, and how I pointed out how there was a lot of stuff connected to the Julian calendar, because Julian Edelman was the MVP of the Super Bowl, and then we had Julian Assange being arrested and Julian Castro in the news. So I was paying attention to the Julian calendar, and August 24th on the Julian calendar, or on the Gregorian calendar, was August 11th on the Julian calendar, which linked to that Tisha B'Av. And on August 24th that day, Andrew Luck announced his retirement from the NFL. And then on that same day, there was a big rift in the Gematria community because Zack got mad at Derek for going to Anarchadelphia or something of the sort. It was something to do with Anarchadelphia. And, you know, they never really liked each other ever since. So it's just like, there was a rift in the Gematria community, all linked to the Julian calendar, linked to the umbrella symbolism that I was following. It's like, I mean, you just gotta be kidding me. And the same day Andrew Luck announces his retirement, I mean, it's crazy. And even Andrew Luck was even involved in this other post here, wherever I put it. At the bottom of this post, Andrew Luck came up in the news as I was writing that blog post. Andrew Luck became the new GM at Stanford at November 30th. So it was just after I made this, just before I made this blog post, Andrew Luck was in the news. You know, so it's just interesting how Andrew Luck somehow seems to be connected to that umbrella symbolism. The umbrella symbolism is all about mind control. And what I think that it is doing is making everybody decode the way that Zack always decodes, and with no explanation of... I mean, I'm not saying every decode is bad either. There's pieces of the decodes that do make sense. But there's a lot of times where things are just not explained, you know? Like, not every single thing is bad in the decodes that other people are doing. I should have mentioned that a long time ago in the video. It's just that there's so many things that are just pure speculation, and there's no explanation as to why they chose to put these certain things in this and measure from this certain date. So it makes it mysticism. That is the biggest point that I want to get across. The story has to involve what you are connecting it to. You can't just speculate that it is connected because you believe the Catholic Church is ruling the world. You know, I mean, you can make a narrative and say that they are through things, but there's still no explanation of why they chose a certain word at a certain time. And if you can explain that, then it will be more believable to anybody. But that is the thing. That's why people think it's nonsense. Because you're just choosing random words and making a narrative out of it. But it almost seems like, you know, they used him to move along this culture of conspiracy that they are controlling, and they want people to decode that way, to stay lost and not understand more about what they're actually doing, and to not pay attention to the synchronicities and not pay attention to the way your life and other lives and everything around you is connected through this system, you know? Like I said in other videos, even if we rid the world of the Freemasons and the Jesuits and everything, and we got rid of all of the language, and that would all happen by the numbers. That would all happen by a code. And even if we got rid of language altogether, everything, there's always going to be things that are symbolic, that have meaning to people, and it's going to create things to happen. You know, you're going to see synchronicities in the forest, in the grass, in the trees, in the sky. You know, these things are always going to be around us no matter what we do. We're not changing a thing. We're never going to, like I said, even if we take down what we think is the cabal, it's not changing the world until we understand what the world really is, you know? And we're not going to understand that by just continually blaming everything on a cabal without even having an explanation of why we're choosing these things. So I guess, hopefully you get the point of this video. I'm just really trying to make people understand why other people don't understand what you're doing. And I wanted to actually show people a reason why that I'm using the ciphers that I'm using. I'm going to skip over the composite ciphers just because I've talked about that a whole bunch recently, made a ton of videos on how it's related to, you know, the Donald Trump assassination attempt and why I started paying attention to it. I don't want to... I've already made the video long enough. It's way longer than I thought it was going to be, but I'll just leave the video with, just because you think you're awake, don't think for a second that something isn't controlling you and still programming your mind with ideas and thoughts to think a certain way, because I really think that is what's going on. I think that all of this is controlled, and even though I want to believe that we're awake and so on, I don't think that we are. And I think it's all part of the whole structure and system of whatever is controlling the world. We were supposed to learn this knowledge, and I feel like for whatever reason, I'm supposed to tell people about the things that I see that don't make sense, because maybe it will spark some other people to realize the things that they're doing they're not doing correctly. It doesn't make sense, and maybe open up their mind that they are also still being programmed. And I'm thinking about that myself, even making this video. So it's very complex. So hopefully that makes sense. Not trying to disrespect anybody, like I said. So have a good one. Peace.